This is The Poet Speaks, a show all about oral tradition.
Hip-hop and cardboard boxes on the block, reggaeton, bandolero, soy yo, heavy metal, punk rock, and la junior high pop.
And what makes poetry so amazing, so incredible, is its absolute fascination and ability to change our lives. The oral tradition, the reason why we speak. This is The Poet Speaks.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Poet Speaks podcast. Now, our next guest is a Brooklyn-based poet. Her first book, Dialect of a Skirt, published by Hanging Loose Press, was a finalist for the 2011 Paterson Poetry Prize and included on the list for the best books of 2010 at about.com and the bestseller list for small press distribution and the Poetry Foundation. Her second book, Morphology, was the winner of the Right Bloody Publishing Jack McCarthy Book Award. She teaches performance poetry and fiction at Pace University, as well as essay writing at College of Staten Island for the City University of New York. She's also a freelance photographer, a New Yorker, and a mama. Everyone, welcome to the Poet Speaks podcast, Erica Miriam Fabri. Erica, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Absolutely. We're so excited to have you. Now, before we begin, we ask everybody, what is your current location? Where are you talking to us out in the big, beautiful world?
My current location is I'm at home in Brooklyn. It's a very hot early July, but it's perfect. It's perfect.
Yes. It is a hot, sweltering summer this year for sure. Now, tell us, are you born and bred New Yorker? That's where you're from? That's your stomping grounds?
No, I'm originally from Pennsylvania, but I've now been in New York for 27 years. So,
Ooh.
yeah, I've been in New York now much longer than I lived in Pennsylvania. Yeah.
That is amazing. So tell me, I mean, what happened? Did the city just steal your heart? Like it steals so many people's hearts and bank accounts and wallets and everything else?
Oh yeah, I mean, I often say I think I love New York more than everyone. When people are like, it's too expensive, I need to leave, I say there's nowhere else to live. I'm actually from the Pocono Mountains, which is really close to New York. And I always say that the Poconos sort of feel like they are part of New York, even though they're so very different. So yeah, New York was a big influence. You know, even though I'm in the state of Pennsylvania growing up, my family were Giants fans. If you need to go to the airport, you go to New York City, if you need a major airport. And New Yorkers are always traveling. It only takes, depending where you are, about an hour and a half to 2 hours. So I was definitely in love with New York since I was very young. And that was always the plan, was to get here as soon as I can.
Okay. Now tell me, since you were young, I mean, has it fulfilled your wildest dreams and expectations that you had?
I think so. I love New York City. The only complaint I've ever made is that I didn't live somewhere else first. Because once I got here, I refused to leave. So I always say, maybe if I'd lived somewhere else and then came to New York to stay for good. But instead, I arrived and I will never live anywhere else.
Fair enough. Okay. All right. Well, tell us a bit about, I mean, as you kind of stated, you know, New York is just, that has become your home. Tell us a little bit about kind of your childhood and how that, did New York, did you find writing when you moved to New York, or did you find it in your childhood where you grew up in Pennsylvania? Where did poetry, how did it enter into your life, and where was the location that it entered into your life at?
That's a great question. I say this to my students all the time. I always wrote poetry, but I didn't like it when I studied it in high school. And I moved to New York. I was studying acting. I wanted to be a writer. I took a poetry class, and then that was it. There was no turning back when I got to college. So this is something I feel really passionate about. I think poetry is taught poorly in high school. I think a lot of high schools, I can't say all of them, teach like the same three poets. Like, I think most high school students are like, I found Shakespeare boring. I didn't like Robert Frost. I didn't like Emily Dickinson. So I'm really passionate about the way poetry is taught in high school, if there's a way to change that. Because I myself, like once I found poetry, especially the spoken word scene and contemporary poetry, I believe this is like what I was meant to do. So how can a genre of art be taught in high school and someone dislike it?
Yeah, that's such an interesting point though. Because a lot of people do kind of feel very similar, poetry is taught maybe through just, I kind of almost want to say maybe just a white European lens. You obviously know the Shakespeares of the world, Dickinson, Emily Dickinson, right? But, it's not, you're not getting, maybe people like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, right? You're not getting some of these just, people from Nepal, right? Indigenous people, women, marginalized people, all type of identities, which is what oral tradition really succumbs to. For you, I mean, how did you that's such an interesting thing to look at, especially teaching youth. How did your youth react to that when you kind of introduced maybe a different type of curriculum, exposing them to poetry?
Well, it's different. It's different in New York City. New York City became really, it's also different now than it was 20 years ago. I'm old enough to tell my students there was no YouTube in my life at a certain point. And I really think that the spoken word movement felt really underground until suddenly the internet and YouTube took over. And it used to be that you had to get to a poetry reading. And I compared it to Comic-Con. You know how Comic-Con used to be an underground thing, but when you arrived at Comic-Con, there was thousands of people there. So you're like, it can't be that underground. How did all these people find out about it? That's what I think Poetry Slam used to be. And then my textbook in a lot of my college classes is YouTube. I say suddenly we had technology changed and we had cameras in our pockets at all times, really high definition cameras that could put poets onto YouTube. And suddenly it was no longer a genre that you had to be in that city and in that venue. It's suddenly the whole world found out about it. So my students now know about spoken word poetry. But I still have college students that show up, they're in a poetry class, they tell me they don't like poetry. I tell them I'm very excited to hear that on day one of class, and I challenge them that by the end of the semester, they will love it. And I brag that I have about 100% success rate. And it's exactly what you just said. We break down why only these two or three poets, why they were all wildly white and male. And I kind of blame it on what I blame all misinformation on is it was only people with a certain financial status that could even go to school. The publishing industry was only a certain group of people. And then there was like a major amount of censorship of then which specific authors would be taught, right? And the more democratic information can be spread, the more democratically it can be spread. I think it's like unearths that wasn't even a true account of time. That was just a few people.
No, that's very powerful, I think. And it's, you talk to other people that have very similar mindsets. It's common sense, right? For folks, maybe. But then, you talk to even kids, it may not be in their peripheral brain that like they've been marketed a certain type of person, like you said, that's white male, that does art. They may not even realize it's only because they've have the privilege, right, to have access to the resources to have their things marketed. That's such a really powerful point if you kind of break it down in that way. But moving on a bit, I want to talk about Dialect of a Skirt. So that is one of your first collections. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Dialect of a Skirt, that's such a powerful title. I remember reading that. What does that phrase mean to you now, as the title of your collection, looking back at your very first one? I mean, does it have a different meaning? Well, first off, tell us when you created that Dialect of a Skirt, what was the meaning then? And then tell us, what does it mean now, almost some decades later?
Yeah, 15 years.
15
There's
years.
15 years between the two books. I published Dialect of a Skirt, have it. On my 30th birthday is when I published my first book. And the title is there's a poem titled Dialect of a Skirt, and the whole book is titled after it. And it meant dialect as in speech, a type of speech and communication. So how the voice, the speech of someone wearing a skirt, either because they were traditionally expected to because they're a woman, those who wear skirts by choice. So the voice, the dialect of those who wear skirts, either, like I said, because they were forced to or because they want to. And I specifically love the word dialect because a whole nation will speak a language, but then one specific group will form a dialect. Like one specific group with one specific experience will say, this is how we speak to each other. So the voice of a woman, I guess, would be the most simplistic way to say it. And I think a lot of poets, myself included, your first book is where you find your voice. And your first book, it's the first time you published a book. So it encompasses the time period from birth until publication date. You feel like you need to cover like your youth, your coming of age, the time finding your voice and your identity. And the specific poem Dialect of Skirt is about a girl finding her voice despite like what the outside world stereotypically believes about you visually, you know, and your voice that you find for yourself being separate from that.
Yeah. My goodness. Yeah. When you kind of look back on, I mean, obviously that's your first collection. What are the thoughts, feelings that could you even, maybe articulate what was the inarticulate emotions you had 15 years ago? Can you articulate them now to see how that's transformed with you as you write your second collection 15 years later?
Yes, I wrote the book, so I obviously know the book. I read it so many times, but right as I was finishing my new book, just before I sent out to publishers, I sat down and reread all in one sitting, reread all of Dialect of a Skirt. I suddenly said, what's changed? Am I using the same words? Do I sound like the same poet? I'll notice I use the same word again and again in a book. And sometimes I'll just give up and say that word is supposed to be in this book a lot, right? Um, and some of it felt distanced. Some of it is still really, really raw and close. There's a main character in Dialect of a Skirt who they're a real life muse. And between Dialect of a Skirt and Morphology, that's the new book, they died. And they were such a main character in the first book that I wanted them in the second book in this new format. They're like it's through their death, the grief of it, and then they visit as a ghost. So some characters literally are repeated, some styles are repeated, and then some things are so different.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm curious then, so you definitely have that shift between Dialect of a Skirt and Morphology. So kind of what would you say who you are? Who were you then when you wrote Dialect of a Skirt, and who are you now when you wrote Morphology? If you could even summon that into a phrase of who you were then versus now.
Yeah, that's hard. I could say literally. I mean, there's things that are obviously different. I was a mother for the second book. And not in the first. Like I said, there's people in my life that have disappeared. That's a major change. When I talk about the first book being Finding Your Voice, it opens with a poem it's a letter. It says, Dear poetry editor, please publish my poems. So I was definitely in that space. And then I think by the second book, it's 15 years of if that first book was Finding Your Voice, then that voice goes out and like lives in the world. It loves, it feels hardship and loss. And in the second book, it opens with a poem that says, Dear poetry. So instead of Dear poetry editor, please publish me, it's like, Dear poetry, this is what you've been to me, or this is who you are to me. And so that's what I would say. That voice is still there, but now that voice is like maybe more confidently gone out into the world and lived it and learned more from that experience.
Absolutely. I find that so fascinating. I ask that because I think it's such a pointed question, especially when someone takes such a pause between collections, right? 15 years definitely is, I mean, it's almost like a quarter of a century with a decade with some change. And I'm so curious, kind of for you, what was that 15-year pause? Was it sometimes just finding yourself in the writing again? What was the reasoning for taking 15 years in between the first and second collection for you?
Well, I mean, there's really personal reasons, right? That are obvious. I mean, obvious to me. Um, I think for one, there's a pressure. Like I said, you have from birth till age 30 for the first book, and you feel like, how much life do I need to live
Mm,
to make sure the second book has as much value? I don't believe this anymore. I'm already almost done with book 3, right? But I think at one point I felt like you need to live the years to be able to
mm,
write the book, right? And then I think that there's a certain number of years of promotion. Um, like, oh, let me let this book live for 5 years before I get to the next one. And then let's say after that 5 years in my actual personal life, especially for me, it came at a time when I was just about to get divorced and I'm like ready to do all these new things with my career. And then suddenly we were all like, hey, we just want to get by for a couple of years,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I could blame all of that. Sometimes I like it. 15 is my favorite number.
Mm,
Um, and so I always sort of muse over this. Like I write a lot about the year I was 15. The one character who's like a main character in the book and then has passed away, the that person is like my first love from when I'm 15. So then I published my first book at 30. That's 15 twice.
yeah.
Then 15 years for the next. I keep wondering if there's symbolism in this, but I also am not going to wait another 15 years for the next book.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. Well, no, thank you so much for sharing that. Definitely, it's you kind of go through seasons, right? You thought one way before, now you're like, no, I'm ready. I'm already on the third book. So for sure, that's a very beautiful seasons
Yeah.
in your life, regardless of how they turn out. Now, kind of in that in between, I find this so interesting. You've really reached poetry in ways I think many people can't even imagine. So you've worked with the Knicks, HBO, Nickelodeon. Tell our audience, I mean, how do you translate poetry for spaces that aren't really even poetic? You don't think of poetry when you think of, maybe basketball,
Mm.
HBO per se, something like Nickelodeon. Tell us a bit about the projects that you've done with these different spaces, and again, how have you really looked at poetry and taken it into these different environments that people just don't really think of a poet to be in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that question because I think well, for one, I'll say all those spaces are examples of spaces that actually came requesting poetry,
Hmm.
either from an organization I work for or from me. With the New York Knicks, for many years, I ran a program that they funded and sponsored that was a scholarship program for high school seniors. And the concept was the same way young scholars will receive a scholarship because they have a talent for athletics. They created a scholarship where the talent would be for poetry. So they
Wow.
would submit poems.
Yeah.
And Syracuse University joined 1 year. We have some colleges that join year after year. Some did 1 or 2 years. And it was a really beautiful program. The idea was that their talent is poetry. They would submit poetry and they would win a full ride scholarship. And the Knicks sponsored that, and along with it, they ran a poetry slam. So
Mm,
the poetry slam, the students who won the poetry slam won a cash prize to be used toward tuition. And then the ones that did the scholarship contest won a full ride scholarship to several schools for several years. They don't sponsor that program anymore.
mm.
Um, Only because they have a rule where they'll sponsor one specific program for a certain number of years and then they'll fund another. So they kept us the maximum number of years, and the
Mm.
program was through Urban Word NYC.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. My goodness. I mean, what an amazing, how many years did that go on? You said there was only a max number. How many years
Yeah.
were they doing
There
that?
was we ran the scholarship program for 10 years, and the program itself was called Creatively College Bound.
Mm,
The idea was using poetry, creative writing, to have workshops that would lead students through the college writing process. And that
mm.
program, um, it's still running on a smaller scale in individual schools that are our partners. So that program's been about 20 years.
My goodness. Wow.
Yeah.
So that's such an interesting kind of thing. I mean, because, a lot of people wouldn't, I'm curious for an organization like the Knicks, which I know is just kind of owned by some random faceless billionaire. What was the kind of initiative there where they really just wanted to sponsor kids to go full rides off of poetry? What was their really kind of, inspiration to do something like that?
Well, the team I work with is amazing
Mm,
because although the Knicks is, like you said, this giant corporation run by billionaires for sure, there will be one department that's just in charge of philanthropy. And
gotcha.
that department is really amazing. So that the specific team I work with, they were phenomenal. And they wanted to, they would, and like you asked about poetry in their space, they would come to us and ask for ideas
Mm,
and really allow us to say, hey, on the poetry side, we're the experts. And Urban Word NYC is a youth organization
mm,
that serves young poets in New York City, ages 13 to 19. And they also run the Youth Poet Laureate program, which is the program that Amanda Gorman was in to become the Poet Laureate. And eventually she was the inaugural poet.
mm.
So
Uh,
same program. Yeah,
Got
so it
you,
was like
got
the
you.
Knicks coming to a poetry organization and partnering. So it was really beautiful.
Got you. Tell us about your work, poetry and Nickelodeon. Tell us about what you were able to do there.
So for Nickelodeon, I worked on for several years, I worked on a project with the Heritage Month,
Mm,
uh, for all the Heritage Months. So I myself wrote some poems that they would turn into really creative, we call them commercial spots, but they're not selling anything.
mm,
I guess it'd be more apt to maybe call them tiny short films, but
mm,
very short, 20 to 30 seconds. Some of them I wrote, some of them I would select again youth poets, and we'd run a workshop where they'd write poems. I'd help edit and perfect them, and then those poems, either the poems I wrote or the poems they wrote, would be used for the various heritage months. They did Black History Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, Asian American Pacific Islander Month. Um, and I love that program too, because I'm sure Nickelodeon could have writers just sort of simply put that together for them. But the
yeah.
fact that they again wanted to come to a poetry organization, they wanted to find youth poets or use active poets to write the poetry. And then they use their own animations and special effects to make these really beautiful commercial spots.
Wow, that is quite the work that you've been able to do. Tell us, I mean, a lot of people that I think a lot of people just look at poetry again, like we started off our conversation, maybe not the most exciting job, maybe, Shakespeare, playing paper. But it's like, when you hear someone like you who's turned it into so many different avenues, into media, visual formats. I think that gets people really excited because it turns on just it's so much creativity. Do you have any advice? I mean, for people that kind of they want to expand their writing outside of just, maybe just some verses and stanzas. How did you get yourself so networked into all these different opportunities and mediums for your poetry?
That's an excellent question. As you're asking it, I'm questioning how did I do that? I think I think one thing a lot of poets, especially even now, but definitely say 10 to 15 years ago, there was a tremendous poetry community.
Mm,
And I think being a part of a community is a really big deal. Knowing other poets, knowing other writers, having these conversations. Then I think that poets are so often leading workshops. There's a lot of organizations in New York City specifically that partner with the pretty well-known spots. New York Poets Cafe will run workshops. The Bowery Poetry Club will run workshops. Urban Word NYC, Poets House. Um, and I think sort of networking and the leading writing workshops again and again sort of led to just different avenues, different pathways.
mm,
Another thing I will say is I myself feel like I've followed technology.
yeah.
Like I said, when I started out, you would find out where the open mics or the poetry slams were, and you would go and you would be a part of this thriving community. And then slowly people would come in with like big cameras and be like, this is amazing, we want to film it. But still, people had to have a big camera. And I sound old to say this, but it took a while until the camera on our phone was really high quality.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, even more media was happening. And then I had to also watch the shift from just like YouTube videos at poetry slams to an Instagram reel, something that's 10 seconds that's just quickly showing a poem. And I think I've just tried to follow the changes, right?
Yeah.
If I wanted to be really stubborn and say poems are supposed to be published in a book on a page, then I would be missing out. I'd be missing out on sharing my work with the world, and I'd be missing out on collaborating with other poets. I'm guilty of it, right? Like we've watched the world transform into a big digital space. Books are heavy. I walk and take the train in New York City. We can't carry 3 books at all times, but if we have the Kindle app, we can have an unlimited number of books we can read on the subway.
Yeah.
So the more we're guilty of finding the burden of a book difficult, I feel like as the writers, we're like, well, how do I fit into that digital space too?
Yeah, that's such a great point, though, with that idea of, I love how you said you kind of made sure that you followed, not necessarily followed, but you, maybe not the word follow, but you kept up to date. That's how you really were able to keep your opportunities open, and it's one of those things. It's, especially as now we're like inundated with AI, artificial intelligence. It's almost like I remember I heard an artist, they had just put it like, we have to learn to work with it now. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like you can't reject it per se. You just have to learn to work with it. So that's kind of almost I think maybe some of the message that you're sending to, people that want to get into these, expand their reach with their poetry and writing. You have to learn to work with the times, right? You gotta,
Yeah.
you gotta be strategic. You have to be crafty. You have to be open-minded, I'm sure.
Mhm. I had a poetry exhibition um about a year and a half ago, and it was on a screen at Times Square.
Wow.
And it's called an exhibition called Zaz, that puts up these 15-second clips. Um, and so I worked with a graphic designer, and they were like little fragments of my poems, all from the new book. Um, and at first you're like, why is there only a fragment of the poem? You need to read the poem in
Yes.
completion, beginning
Mm.
to end. But then I said, hey, again, we're all guilty of it. We flip through Instagram, we look at something for a moment. If you give something 15 seconds, that's a long time. So I was like, well, maybe you need to accept that your poem might be broken into fragments, um, and hope that that fragment grabs someone enough to want to read the whole poem, to want to buy the book.
Yeah.
And the other way I sort of resigned myself to this is Sappho, who
Mm.
is a poet from ancient Greece. A lot of her work was destroyed, and all we have left are fragments of her poems, and she's still one of the most famous poets. And if her work was able to be fragmented and still important, then maybe we can let go of the modern fragmentation of our work, right?
Now that to me is so fascinating because it kind of goes into this idea, as you kind of translate your poetry into spaces, like I said, that are not always poetic. I mean, it's kind of, as you see your poems, like you said, in Times Square, fragmented kind of bits and pieces, what's that feeling like? You kind of touched on that. Do you feel protective over the work when it's now translated into a completely different medium that's not necessarily just writing? It's now maybe a hybrid of writing, sound, and it may not be just your voice now, right? Now, because when we read your poetry out of a book, off a page, that's all you. And of course, I'm reading it through my own lens and tone. But when you add in these different mediums and elements, visual, the environment of a place like Times Square, now it's broken into
Yeah.
pieces. Do you feel, like you said, do you feel that possessiveness as an artist, as the creator over, your words?
Well, like I said, a little bit. But the same way I said I have to lean into the changes in technology, I
Mm,
feel like you have to lean in, you have to change your point of view. Instead of saying someone broke my poem up, you have to be like, someone saw a piece of my poem,
mm,
and maybe
mm,
that will make them go and read the rest. With the new book, the publisher suggested we make merch. I have a tote bag with a line from a poem. And so that, it's like changing your mindset. Like it's not that the poem is broken up. It's like, isn't that cool if someone sees that tote bag with that one line, and maybe that will make them interested in reading the rest of the poem, wanting more, right?
So do you want to do that then? That's also a good question too. I mean, like how much of that are you willing to engage in? Like a tote bag, merch with a t-shirt? I mean, how much of that do you feel like, as someone that loves what they do, I mean, how much of that do you feel like you want to engage in to, I guess in some ways, appease some form of audience?
It does feel like appeasing And it also feels like end stage capitalism,
Mhm.
right? Like everything is marketing, everything is like make an advertisement and trick someone into paying attention. It does, right? But like I said, sometimes I have to sort of look at myself like I'm guilty of it, right? Like if I suddenly learn of a new poet, I want to immediately Google them and find as many poems as I can. I'm like, is there a video of them? Can I read three, four poems? Rather than, I guess, in the past, someone might have recommended a poet to you and you might have ran to the bookstore and
Mm.
bought their book and went home and spent time with them. I'm guilty of saying, well, let me check out this poet that was recommended to me and wanting to be able to find them
Yeah.
in that internet space. So if I'm guilty of when I'm on the other end of searching for art, of wanting to search for it that way, then I guess I want to be grateful of providing it in that way too. If that makes sense, right?
Absolutely fair, fair. No, and I think that's such a question, especially as you become, I mean, I guess whether, if you're selling books, you do become part of that game of money and capitalism. I know I've definitely been down that road myself, but no, we appreciate you giving that very honest, genuine perspective. Now, kind of shifting gears a bit. Now, you've shared your work in drug rehabilitation centers, hospitals, and prisons, right? I guess some would almost say, I almost want to say places like that can be very sacred spaces in terms of, it's a lot of stories, right? A lot of walks of life. You go to a prison, it's the good, the bad, the ugly of life, right? Same with hospitals, right? Same with, again, drug rehabilitation centers. It's a culmination of a lot of life has lived to where people have ended up in those places, right? For you, I mean, what does it mean to bring poetry into, again, spaces like that again are not viewed as poetic, and they're viewed as really life spaces? I almost want to say a lot of life goes through places like those centers, hospitals, and prisons.
In a lot of ways, I think those are the most poetic spaces. Um, those kind of spaces, for one, sometimes they're not a lot of times they're not overwhelmed by like daily life the way we all are, right? Like often we're trying to be like, when can I quiet the noise and get time to write?
Yes.
When can I like stop all the things on my daily to-do list to be introspective? And often in spaces like that, they're already in a really introspective space. Like
Mhm.
whatever got them there, they're actually there, hopefully. Like if the space is a truly healing space, successfully healing, right? They should be in a space where they're like, hey, you're here to be introspective and to stop and try and like they're generally in a mindset where they want to like figure life out. They want to be like, where
Mm.
did this happen to me? I want to rewind. I want to retell these stories. I want to examine this part of myself. So a lot of times I feel like they're the most ready for poetry. Does that make sense?
Mm. Mhm.
And not burdened in any way by the idea of academia or the idea of this is the way I'm supposed to do this. You know, I say this about teenagers too. I sometimes think that teenagers have an edge on the adult poets.
Mm.
They're still in such a raw emotional space
Mm.
that I think as adults we have to force ourselves to stay in, right?
That's interesting. Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me a bit about, I mean, how did you get involved in that type of work then? How did you, again, I'm sure there's many people that listen, I hear of poets going to prisons, centers, but I guess that pathway to even get into those spaces, I think for most people is still a question mark. Tell us again, how did you get into these spaces and decide that poetry was what you wanted to share there?
I mean, a lot of it is, there's this cliche, like you're not gonna get any work as a poet, right? And
Yes.
it's not, and like I said, you do sort of like become really involved in a certain kind of community and then learn from your mentors, learn from your poet peers. Um, I do a lot of nonprofit work. And so some things, you would try it out and be like, this is the one I love most. Sometimes someone would do that and be like, that's not the space I want to be in. I want to be in this kind of space where I teach writing. And I definitely feel like the more I love being in spaces that poetry wasn't the first thing they came for. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And of course it's wonderful to be, let's say, in a poetry MFA where everyone like eats, sleeps, and breathes poetry. But I actually think I've had the most enjoyment in spaces where poetry came as a surprise.
Yeah. Yeah.
And something that felt like this is just exactly what I needed. Instead of feeling like I'm obsessed with this thing, I learn the most because I'm in a poetry world all the time. So if I can be in a space where someone feels like, oh, this is so new to me. And I think kind of like what we talked about earlier, I think the canon of poetry, literature, art for centuries is always only told by like the most privileged classes.
Yeah.
And I want the stories that come from the people that aren't in those places of privilege. We want to have like we want to have the real stories.
Yeah.
We get information more democratically now than ever before, and it's still questionable what we can believe and not.
Yeah.
But I think you're going to get the truest stories in environments that aren't like at the height of academia or the height of whatever's considered the best place you can be to be a poet, right?
Tell me a bit. I mean, because you seem like it's I love what you had said just about a minute ago. You had said teenagers actually have an edge up on adults in terms of tapping into that raw emotion. Us as adults, we kind of almost have to force ourselves back into that space. Like I said, it's like we're trying to, as adults, we now articulate what was inarticulate to us before when we were youth, right? It's almost the fact that we can now articulate ourselves actually has deterred us because now it's like we don't imagine anymore, right? There's no question, there's no vagueness, right? And in the vagueness is almost where art can really be made because it's actually genuine. What is that? What kind of makes you so passionate about working again? When you were working with the Knicks, Nickelodeon, what makes you so passionate about working with just the youth population? Younger, they get young every day. A new generation is born every single day, and access to maybe poetry isn't there for you. Why is that it seems, I don't know you in terms of personally, but it seems like that is something that drives you working with the youth in poetry.
Yeah. I mean, there's this cliche most of us have heard all our life that, some cliches are right, but when they say like throughout your life, like maintain that childish wonder or maintain that childish spirit.
Yeah.
It's so real. There is this wonder and there is this unapologetic raw emotion that I think as adults too, we're like, act appropriate. It's not a big deal, right? Like we're always trying to be appropriate or not embarrass ourselves or show that we're under control.
Yes.
And I think when we're younger, we didn't care about that, right? We're like, I do feel out of control. And it made really amazing art. There's also this idea of like with the youth, they're like, there's this whole world ahead of me. They don't feel really cynical yet. They're like, there's this whole world of things I will do someday. And I swear they saved me, right? Like my college students, even 21 and under, teenagers, I feel like the fact that instead of me always being only in adult spaces, but being with young people, it keeps me feeling that like that wonder and that like unapologetic passion, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's such a fascinating thing. When you kind of encounter that, is definitely, and it's one of those things when you encounter an adult that has that, it's very easy to tell. It's almost like they enter into a room differently. Like you can tell they have a knowingness where they're just, again, it's like, I don't want to say it's irresponsible, but it's almost the world is their oyster. They're still looking forward to things, even if they're, because at one point I thought 22 was old. I was like, at one point, I mean, and then I thought 30 was old. And then, I mean, like, talking to older people in my life that are like in their 70s, and it's such an interesting kind of mindset, right? Of age and just, what is really that mindset? Can you keep yourself open to the world still? Curiosity, can you
Yeah.
still stay curious no matter what the age is? That really makes, I think, it points a lot of direction in your life, especially as someone that writes. So no, thank you so much for sharing that. So kind of as we're wrapping up, we talked so much today, Erica, and you really just really dropped a lot of gems for us. And I'm curious, for someone that has turned their poetry into so many different mediums, I do want to ask you this question. So if language is a body, what kind of body are you building in your poetic work?
Mm. Um, I so the new book is called Morphology, and I have it here.
There we go.
Morphology, the word, is the study of the formations of words, and it's also the study of the formations of bodies. So why I chose it as a title is because I feel like this is what the book's doing, and what poetry is doing often is taking the formations of words to explain what we do with our bodies, right? So there's a lot of bodies in the book. So if I had to pick one of them though, I would probably pick a swimming body.
Mm.
Yes, I love swimming. There's a lot of swimming in the book. Um, and I hope that like a constantly moving body, not a body that stays still, a swimming body, and specifically swimming because swimming is so smooth, right? Like hopefully the poems and my work will explain like the pleasures and the horrors of life in a smooth but not in a clunky way, in a smooth way, like water. Although water can be rough, but it sort
Mm.
of always has a wave to it, right?
Absolutely. Love that. Love that. So your swimming body, you like the idea, a body just staying in movement, a body that moves, stays in movement. So no stagnation.
No stagnation. And there's something it almost feels like flying about swimming, right? Like when we're walking, we're like we're hitting the world in a harsh way, right? So I hope
Mm.
poetry can give it that flow.
That's a good way to put it. I like that a lot, for sure. Okay. Now tell me, if you could leave one poem behind, one piece of your voice, what would that be? And could you tell us why? It could be from your from your latest collection. It could be one that you've never shared with the world, but you have to leave one poem behind.
One actual poem.
Hmm?
Literally one poem, like the title.
One, yes, absolutely. One
And
actual poem.
this is like a question I'm often asked, which is just what's your favorite poem of your work? And I can never answer it. And I tell myself, go think about it, pick one. So next time they ask, you answer quick. But it's slightly different because it's not forcing me to pick a favorite. It's just forcing me to pick. I know what it would be. I wouldn't have predicted myself to pick this poem, but I mentioned earlier how right before I published Morphology, I sat down and read through Dialect of a Skirt one more time, all in one sitting. And one poem really surprised me. I didn't expect to. I started crying. It was like I was reading someone else's poem. I know the poem. I wrote it. I know what it's about. I didn't expect that poem years later to shock me. And so that's the poem I would pick. And it's called Blessing,
Hmm.
is its title. And it's about loving someone, even if they've hurt you, that can be a blessing. And
Hmm.
loving someone even after they've made a terrible mistake
Hmm.
or done something terrible, you know? And when I wrote it, it had a really specific muse. And I think when I read it 15 years later, I unexpectedly applied it to other situations,
Wow.
in
Okay.
addition to the original person that was for. So maybe that's the one I would leave behind. It's called Blessing.
Yeah, and I love that. What I like about that question, like you said, it's not quite what's your favorite poem, but it's what you would leave behind, right? So like even when I ask myself that, I know which one I would leave behind, and it's actually not my favorite poem, but it would just be again something that is meaningful in your life. So no.
What's it about? What's the message?
Although mine?
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, you flipped the interview on me. So
Sure.
so that one, the one I would leave behind is a poem I wrote. It was called Generations. It's just about familial trauma and how that trauma just unfurls itself generation after generation till someone just wants to buck the system and break it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So when I look at that idea of just, what would you leave behind? What would it be and why? That's a very kind of what it's almost like asking, if you could take one memory with you from your whole life and take it to the afterlife, what would you take with you? You know what I mean? So it's such a kind of meaningful, powerful question to ask, especially someone that's a poet. So thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you. No, absolutely. So, Erica, one last final question. We asked this to all the poets on the Poet Speaks podcast. Erica, why do you need to get your words out?
I knew you were going to ask this question because I love your podcast. I have in the new book, I have a line where I say something like, I say, what a monster it's to poetry. What a monster you can be if you're not allowed to make the noises you're meant to make. And it's the idea that like if poetry isn't allowed to come out of you, it turns into a monster. And I thought of that quote every time I heard you ask poets this question. But in truth, I think ultimately, I think that I know I shouldn't speak for all of humanity, but I'm going to. I think we're all on this quest to find the meaning of life. And I think it's just making a record of it. It sort of touches on what I said earlier. I think poets and artists in general do a better job of making a record of what life was really like at this moment, rather than relying on the historians and the news, right? So I feel like just so that when we're no longer here, we left a record of what it really felt like, what it really was like. I think it touches on your idea too of generational trauma. Like if we record the things that happened for the next generation, they'd have a truer account of what life was like, maybe to build a different world, perhaps.
Absolutely. A living archive.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. So that's why Erica needs to get her words out, everyone. All right. So Erica, as we finally wrap up, do tell us, again, big thank you to you for this amazing conversation. Tell us what is next for you in the remainder of 2025. And please do drop any social media websites and where we can find your amazing collections as well as all your upcoming news.
Yes, 2025 is halfway over, but I just a month ago published the new book. I already mentioned Morphology. So I'm touring a little, promoting the new book. I start planning in the fall for a poetry festival that I run at Pace University. It's called Pace Poetry Festival, NYC. I'm also a photographer, so I have a new photo project I'm working on. And everything can always be found on my website, which is just ericafabri.com, or on Instagram. Everything links to one another.
Absolutely.
So I would love anyone that wants to come by and say hi.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Erica. Everyone, Erica, all of her amazing details and links for all the amazing things that she's doing. All her links will be down in the description box below, no matter where you're listening to the Poet Speaks podcast. Remember the description and or details box below. All right, Erica, thank you so much for being a guest on the Poet Speaks podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda.
Absolutely.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. And everyone, again, go check out all of Erica's amazing work. And remember the Poet Speaks podcast detail box down below. And check out the Poet Speaks podcast no matter where you listen to your podcast. All right. Bye-bye, everyone.